Chapter 6. They had a quiet dinner that evening, and she realized no one else had arrived. "Where are your business associates?" He smiled, his hand holding hers. "They'll be here tomorrow. And just so you know, it's just Justin and Cody. They each said they were bringing a date, but I don't think they're seeing anyone, so who knows what they'll do." They'd both responded enthusiastically to his suggestion they bring dates. He was surprised because he hadn't been aware of either of them seeing anyone. Of course, they didn't know he was currently sitting here with his nanny, either. "Why did you guys need to come all the way here to have a meeting? You couldn't do it at the office? Or your house?" Her voice conveyed her disbelief. Were they all just so frivolous they felt the need to go to an exotic location every time they had to have a meeting? What did that say for their sense of responsibility? "I wanted to bring you here, because you said you'd never seen the ocean. Justin had been making noise about us needing to have a meeting about something, and I never even asked what. I'd been putting him off for a couple of weeks. So I decided I'd come here and make it a business trip, but bring you and Faith along." He was almost embarrassed to admit there was no real reason for them to be there. Her eyes widened. "So you did this for me?" How could any woman resist a man who would do something so sweet? Why was he still single? He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I needed to get away for a while, too." She stood and walked around the table to sit on his lap, pressing kisses all over his face. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever done for me." Her voice conveyed her pleasure and excitement. His face was serious as he looked her in the eye and said, "You deserve it. You deserve so much more." It was true. He'd never met a more selfless person in his life. She was teaching him to look at the world in a whole new way. He'd been rich for too long and had started taking everything for granted. "Thank you." The sincerity of her voice warmed him. He'd done nice things for other women, but they all seemed to think it was their due. Sure, they'd thank him prettily, but it was nothing on the genuine gratitude he sensed from Bailey. He smiled. "You're very welcome. Now do you want to finish eating, or just go back to bed?" She grinned and pointed toward the bedroom. He didn't have to be told twice. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Reality intruded the following afternoon in the form of the other two couples. Bailey was thrilled to see both Justin and Cody had brought dates with them. When she said that, the woman with Cody shook her head emphatically. "Oh, no. I'm not Justin's date. I'm his administrative assistant." She held her hand out to shake Bailey's. "I'm Sarah Roberts." Sarah was a brunette with striking green eyes. She looked like she was around Bailey's age of 24. Her skin was almost white and flawless, making her look ethereal. "It's nice to meet you. I'm really not a date either. I'm the nanny." She smiled as she shook the other woman's hand. "I'm Bailey Borders." She didn't add that last night she'd slept with her boss, although at this moment it was all she could think about as she watched him chatting with his friends. Bailey turned to the other girl, who had come with Cody. "Are you a date?" she asked with a grin. She shook her head. "I'm Cody's writing instructor." She looked bewildered by that fact. She shook her head. "I'm Amber Cassidy." Amber had blue eyes and dark blonde hair. She kept sneaking glances at Cody, and she'd find him looking at her. She wasn't the type to back down though, and met his gaze fearlessly. Bailey nodded. "I'm sure he'll need you for the horse riding portion of the business meeting," she said with a straight face. All three women burst into laughter, and the men turned to look at them. All three men had besotted looks on their faces. They'd have been ribbing each other about if they hadn't been too busy starting at the women to see each other. Bailey took it upon herself to play hostess. She took the other girls around the beach, showing them the different bungalows available. She held Faith in one arm as they all talked. "I'm sure we can take meals together, or not. Whatever. Steven said they were having their big meeting tomorrow. Do you guys want to hang out on the beach during it? Or we could use the boat for whale watching? She paused. Steven said he'd have someone watch the baby if we wanted to go. It seems strange to let him pay for a babysitter so his nanny can go for a ride in a boat, but who am I to argue? Bailey had missed having her girlfriends around. Ever since her breakup with Bradley, she'd kept to herself, so she was thrilled to have the other women there. Of course, that was around the time Angela had returned home, and she'd had to devote all her spare time to taking care of her pregnant sister and then the new baby. Angela had never really been interested in Faith. Sarah shook her head. That sounds like fun, but I'm sure Justin will need me during the meeting. I mean, he wouldn't have brought me along otherwise, right? Her eyes met Bailey's as if she needed confirmation of her thoughts. I have a feeling the only reason any of us are here is because those men over there thought we should be. Amber shook her head, bemusedly. I still can't figure out why I agreed to come here. Bailey nodded emphatically. They're certainly forceful. She glanced over to where Steven was talking with his friends and found herself blushing as she met his gaze. They're all standing there talking to each other, but looking at us. Sarah sighed. I think maybe we need to go do something just us women. You're right, Bailey. Let them have their meeting alone. They don't need me there. She looked at Bailey. What do you think we should do? Go out on the boat? Hang on the beach? I'm open for anything. Steven also said something about how he could have spa treatments arranged. It didn't sound fun when I was the only girl, but having a spa day could be cool. Bailey threw the idea out to see what the others would say. Amber grinned. That sounds like fun. Let's do this. We'll spend the morning whale watching in the boat, and then come back here for an afternoon of spa treatments. I spend so much time smelling like horses, it would be nice to actually have my nails done and look like a girl for a change. Sarah shrugged. I could go for that. I've never done anything like that. Have you? I did once when I was a teenager, but not since. I've been too busy trying to save my family's ranch so my kid brother will have the life he's always thought he'd have. Amber shrugged. It's all been worth it, too. Bailey simply shook her head. I've been too busy simply struggling to survive. Who can afford a nice spa day? The men moved over toward them, Steven dropping his arm around Bailey's shoulders to show his possession. What did you girls decide to do tomorrow while we're in our meeting? Sarah looked at Justin. You don't need me for the meeting? Justin shook his head. Have fun with the other ladies. Bailey rolled her eyes at Sarah. They're all three just alike, you know. She turned to Steven. We want to go whale watching in the morning, and then in the afternoon we want a spa. She'd never asked for anything from him but money for his daughter, so she waited to see how he'd respond. Sounds good. I'll make the arrangements. Why don't you girls tell me what you want included in your spa package, and I'll make the call. He didn't even blink at her request. Bailey wanted to fling her arms around his neck and kiss him, but she was very aware of their audience. Amber grinned, not having believed it was all that readily accessible. So what are we doing for dinner tonight? Let's do the Polynesian dancer thing again. Cody's eyes lit up as he put his hand on Amber's arm. They'll do a private show for us right here on the island, and we can have them do a luau-type traditional menu or anything we want, really. He looked at Amber, his eyes letting her know her opinion was the most important to him. What would you like to have for dinner? Amber had seemed so confident when it was just the three of them, but now that Cody was there, she seemed confused. I think the traditional thing could be cool. I've never been to a luau before. Cody's eyes met Steven's. My lady wants a luau. You want to handle it, or should I? Steven shrugged. I'll just add it to everything else I'm calling about. He wasn't sure if Bailey even realized it was Valentine's Day, but he did, and he was going to make the evening as special for her as he could manage. She seemed to like being with the other women, so they'd do a group dinner. Justin turned Sarah to face him, talking to her in low tones. The others could barely make out. "Is that all okay with you? I don't want you to be roped into anything you don't want to do." Sarah smiled, her green eyes sparkling. "It all sounds wonderful to me. Thanks for asking." Her face showed her gratitude that he actually cared about her opinions since she wasn't really his date. "I'm getting a sitter for tonight and tomorrow," Stephen announced. "Bailey should be able to participate in the luau, but I have a feeling Faith is a little too young to appreciate the experience." "You don't have to do that. You can stay with the others while I sit with the baby, especially since we're going to be doing a girls' day tomorrow." Bailey felt like she was lacking as a nanny. She wasn't here to be entertained. It was her job to take care of her niece. "I wasn't asking, Bailey." He paused for a moment. "You're not going to spend Valentine's Day in the resort with the baby when you can be with us." He squeezed her shoulders and walked off toward the main resort to make his calls. As he walked off, the other two women looked at Bailey and laughed. She was right. The three men were all the same. "How do you three get along when you all think you have the right to control everyone around you?" she asked Cody and Justin. Justin shrugged. "I guess we all accept the fact that we're equal partners, and we can only control everyone else." All three women laughed at that. It really seemed like the most plausible solution. "Well, I'm going to get the baby into the house. It's time for her to eat." The other four stood on the beach, deciding where they'd all sleep, and Bailey left them to their own devices. Chapter 7. Bailey fed Faith her bottle and gave her a bath. Since she had a sitter coming to care for her that evening, she thought it would be best if Faith needed nothing other than another bottle and diaper change before bed. Stephen came up behind her as Bailey was zipping up her pajamas. When Faith saw him, she gurgled and kicked her feet excitedly. "I think you're her new favorite person." Bailey looked over her shoulder as she said the words, wondering how Stephen would react to his place in Faith's life. He shrugged, but smiled at the little girl. "A babysitter will be here in about an hour. I have the driver of the boat and the same sitter arriving at 9 in the morning. That way you'll have about 3 hours before lunch. The spa is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. They're going to do massages, facials, body scrubs, manicures, and pedicures. They said if you wanted more, you could let them know in the morning." His arms came around her waist as she picked the baby up. "Isn't it really early for her to be in her jammies?" He wasn't sure of her schedule, but it was only 6 in the evening and he hadn't noticed her ready for bed so early at home. She looked down at the little girl in her arms. "Yeah, but I thought it would make it easier for the sitter. I gave her a bath, too. She's ready for bed, other than another couple of diaper changes and her bottle." She turned and handed Faith to him. "I'll be right back." She went into the restroom, not because she needed to, but because she thought it would be good for him to have a private moment with Faith. They were getting closer every day, and she loved that. When she came out of the bathroom, he was sitting on her bed playing with the baby who was lying on her back and kicking her feet as she cooed up at him. She sat down beside him, her hand automatically reaching out to touch him and stroke his shoulder. For some reason, she couldn't seem to keep her hands off him. She'd tried, but her hands seemed to move of their own volition. He turned to kiss her hand and smiled at her. They sat together, playing with the baby for a few minutes. Finally she asked, "Are shorts okay for the luau tonight, or should I be dressing up?" She'd brought a skirt and top, but she would definitely rather dress comfortably. "Oh, shorts are fine. Maybe we'll go spend some time in the hot tub afterward." He watched her when he suggested the hot tub, trying to gauge her reaction. Her eyes flew to his. "You didn't tell me there was a hot tub." She loved the idea of sinking into a hot tub with him, spending time just relaxing and getting to know him better. Of course, if they followed the pattern they'd followed for the past 24 hours, as soon as they were alone, their clothes would fly off. She shrugged. That was one way of getting to know him better. Don't worry about wearing a suit under your shorts. You won't need one, he whispered against her lips. She blushed, but knew she'd probably take him up on that. There was no point in wearing a suit when he was just going to take it off her anyway. She opened her mouth under his, returning his kiss with all the fervor that had built up during the long afternoon. She was going to miss it just being the three of them on the island. By the time the babysitter arrived, Bailey had dressed for the evening. She wore white dress shorts and a light pink tank top. She felt like a nervous mother leaving her baby for the first time as she gave instructions to the sitter on Faith's schedule. Finally, wearing a pair of jeans and a polo shirt, Stephen smiled at the sitter and waved, pulling Bailey from the room. They'll be fine. She sighed. I've only ever left her when I was working. This doesn't feel right. She looked back over her shoulder toward the resort, wishing she could bring the baby, but knowing this was best for all involved. He laughed and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Let's go hang out with the others and have some grown-up fun for a change. He couldn't wait to see her face during the dancing and luau. The experience was so foreign to most Americans, and he knew his nanny from Hamlin would love it. She enjoyed their impromptu luau more than she'd thought possible. Both of the other men were wearing jeans, western shirts, and cowboy hats. Justin seemed slightly out of place in his hat, but she wasn't sure why. After the luau, Stephen smiled and waved to the others, grabbing her hand and dragging her back to the main resort. He pulled her into a room she hadn't discovered yet and flipped on the light switch. The room was small, but contained a good-sized circular hot tub. He strode toward her, throwing off one piece of clothing after another. She laughed, backing up, but toed off her sandals and unfastened her shorts. By the time he reached her, they were both completely nude and they reached for each other, quickly. Their kiss was hot and passionate. He stepped down into the water and snagged her hand, pulling her in with him. Pushing her to the bench beside him, he kissed her wildly, her mouth opening for him and her tongue thrusting out to meet his. She was as ready for this as he was. Her hands went to his chest, running her fingers through the thick thatch of hair there. The hot water added to the heat, burning her blood. She got onto her knees, moving toward him, wanting to get as close as possible. Was it even possible to make love in a hot tub? She was sure she was about to find out. His hands molded her breasts, rubbing his thumbs across her nipples. Their mouths never left each other, each drinking greedily from the other. He put his hands at her waist and urged her onto his lap facing him, a knee on either side of his thighs. He helped lower her onto him, groaning with pleasure as he entered her slowly. She cried out, surprised at how easily he entered and how good it felt. Finally he was buried to the hilt inside her, and she remained completely still for a moment, staring into his dark eyes. His hands at her hips urged her up and down and, moving awkwardly at first, she found her rhythm. It wasn't long before she was burying her face in his neck and crying out with pleasure. He shouted when he found his fulfillment, holding her even closer against him. They stayed entangled for a while, before she lifted her head looking into his eyes. I can't believe we just did that in a hot tub. He laughed, running his thumb along her lip. I can't believe we didn't do this last night. Or at my house. He wiggled his eyebrows at her. You know I have a hot tub at home, right? She blushed, belying the intimacy they still shared under the water. She moved off his lap and onto the seat beside him. I think we need to get out of this water before we both shrivel up. He nodded and they both grabbed robes from the back of the door, and picking up their clothes, moved back out into the main area of the resort. She didn't feel comfortable seeing the babysitter this way, so she went to his suite and showered, putting on the clothes she'd worn for the luau. Looking into the mirror, she saw her face was still flushed and her eyes were happier than she'd ever seen them. "I'm going to go let the babysitter go home," she whispered, stepping on her toes, to kiss his cheek. "I'll see you in the morning." She didn't want to sleep in her room, but she didn't want him to think she was taking it for granted she would sleep in his bed every night. He grabbed her hand before she could move away from him. "We'll use the intercom again. You're sleeping in my bed where you belong." It wasn't a question, but she found that for once, she didn't mind his orders. She was going to sleep where she wanted to sleep, with him. She nodded quickly, running from the room to go talk to the babysitter and thank her for sitting with Faith. The baby was sound asleep when she entered the room, making soft little sounds in her sleep. Bailey was thrilled to see her. She'd felt uneasy about leaving her, but she was fine. Tomorrow would be easier, she knew. The first time was always the hardest. "Did she give you any trouble?" Bailey looked around the room and found it spotless. "Oh no. She was an angel." The sitter was a middle-aged woman who was obviously very experienced with babies. "Thank you so much for watching her for me this evening." Bailey was truly thankful she'd had time to spend with other adults for a change. She loved Faith, but sometimes being around only a baby as many hours a day as she was made her slightly stir-crazy. She saw the babysitter out and went back into Stephen's suite as he'd demanded. She needed to have a talk with him about his high-handed ways, but she was usually too busy obeying him to protest too much. He flipped the switch that would allow them to hear Faith, but not let her hear them, and they fell into bed together. Both were too tired for more than cuddling and holding one another, but she found it even more intimate than making love had been. Faith only woke her once during the night, so she was feeling refreshed for the whale-watching excursion with the other women in the morning. Sarah looked extremely tired, and when Bailey asked if she'd slept okay, she'd simply looked at her with a slightly dazed expression and nodded. She wondered if there were more to it, but if Sarah wanted to talk about it, she would. Lunch with the men went quickly. "How did the meeting go?" Sarah asked as soon as they got back. She looked as if she still felt slightly guilty that she hadn't been present for it. Justin nodded to her. "They liked my ideas. We'll work on implementing them as soon as we get back." Bailey wondered what the new ideas were, but since she knew it was about sports, she decided not to ask in case her eyes started to glaze over again. She didn't want Stephen to think she thought his work was boring, even though she did. The spa had been set up in the main resort in some rooms Bailey had yet to see. They'd set up a massage room, a room for the body scrubs, a nail station, and a facial station. The three women would rotate between the stations, and at the end they'd each have their pedicures and manicures together, so they could talk. Bailey had her massage first, and after realizing the woman doing the massage didn't speak English, sank down to enjoy the experience. She thought she'd have to talk to someone throughout, so it was much more relaxing than she'd expected. They used hot stones for the massage, and she was amazed at how wonderful the stones made her feel. She'd imagined them just placing the stones on her back, but instead the stones were actually used to massage her. She passed the other women, all of them dressed in white robes, as she went into the facial station. Never having done any of this before, Bailey found the whole experience intriguing. She had to lie on her back while the woman smeared different things all over her face and chest, and then they were washed off. She was amazed at just how good it had her feeling. The body scrub was nice, and she was glad she'd had the massage first. It was hard to get used to people having their hands all over her body this way. Finally, she went into the room with the other two, and they all sat in chairs. Their feet were dipped in hot paraffin wax. They chatted about the men, the whales they'd seen, the men, their other treatments, the men, the beach day they wanted, the men, and everything else that came to mind. By the time they were finished, Bailey was thrilled at how her skin glowed. Her nails were a pale shade of pink she thought would go nicely with most of her clothes. She was thrilled she'd had a day to get to know the other two women, and they talked about meeting up for lunch when they were back in the States. She was thrilled to have made friends with two women who were so special. Chapter 8. When it was time to leave the island and return to the real world, it was all Bailey could do not to cry. Their idyllic time on the island had shown her just how much she was in love with Steven. How was she going to be able to go back to being just his nanny? That's what she needed to do, though. It wouldn't be right for her to continue working for him and sleeping with him as well. They said goodbye to the other two couples in Bora Bora. Bailey hugged her new friends tightly, and they made plans to meet for lunch in a couple of weeks. Once they were back on the plane and Faith was buckled in, she broached the topic she had been trying to avoid with Steven. "We have to go back to how things were." She hated saying the words and fought to keep the tears down, but she couldn't live with him as his mistress. It wasn't right, and it wasn't something she could do and feel good about herself. "What do you mean?" He was obviously clueless about what she was saying. "I can't continue to work with you and sleep with you." She looked down at her hands as she said the words, hoping he wouldn't press her on the topic. "Why?" His eyes were harsh as he asked the single-worded question. There was anger on his face. He'd obviously expected their relationship to stay the way it had been, and he wasn't happy she was insisting on a change. "It's not right for us to sleep together in the same house where Faith is growing up. If she weren't involved, maybe I could do it, but she is. And it would hurt a lot if Connie found out we'd been sleeping together. Don't ask me why, because I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I couldn't bear for her to know." She looked down at her hands as she spoke the words. The real reason wasn't one she could discuss with him. She fell more in love with him every time they made love. How could she possibly go on living with him and making love with him every night without it hurting so much she couldn't go on? He shrugged. "If that's what you want." He turned away from her and opened his laptop, making it clear he would work on the way home. From the look on his face, she deduced that her decision to return their relationship to what it had been before the island didn't matter to him in the least. She turned away from him then, because she couldn't stifle the single tear on her cheek. He didn't care enough to even fight for them. She picked up one of the books she'd brought for the trip and never had time to crack. If he wasn't going to talk to her on the way home, she had plenty of time to get through a couple of them. Once they were home, they fell into an easy routine. She learned his schedule and avoided him wherever possible. He didn't seek her out. Obviously, she was nothing more to him than a vacation fling. She'd always be grateful for their time on the island, though. They'd made enough memories to last a lifetime. And they'd have to last that long, because she knew she'd never love anyone else the way she loved him. At times, she would become angry with herself for entering into a physical relationship with a man who obviously didn't care for her, but then she'd remind herself of the memories she had to carry through her entire life. She'd done the right thing, no matter how wrong it sometimes felt. He went with her to the doctor with Faith when she got her shots and asked for the paternity test to be done. Bailey wondered how he'd react if he found out Faith wasn't his, but she didn't worry about it too much. Angela had assured her Steven was her baby's father. They had a pleasant lunch out, during which they talked about the baby and nothing else. Every other subject seemed to be suddenly taboo between them by mutual consent. Once they were back at the house, Steven went back to avoiding her, and she went back to avoiding him. When she walked up the stairs away from him after the doctor's appointment carrying the baby he knew wasn't his, he wondered again what he'd done to make her not want to be around him any longer. He'd planned on coming back from the island and buying the biggest diamond ring he could find. He'd never expected her to break it off on the plane. He'd wanted to marry her and provide a proper home for the baby. He shook his head sadly. If she lived with him long enough, maybe he could find a way to mend whatever he'd torn apart. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Bailey had been in his employ for almost 3 months when she realized she'd not had a period since she moved in. She'd always been extremely regular and sat down looking at a calendar to make sure she wasn't imagining things. She went to the kitchen, her face white with shock, and asked Connie if she would mind watching Faith while she went to the store. Connie took one look at Bailey's face and immediately agreed. She hugged Bailey and told her if she needed to talk, she was there for her. Bailey smiled and thanked her. She put Faith in her saucer in the dining room and left the house. She drove the Cadillac to the nearest drugstore. Connie had been right. Stephen had her car towed off almost as soon as the Cadillac was on his property. She bought a simple pregnancy test. The test said it could be taken any time of day, and the results would clearly state pregnant or not pregnant. She didn't think she could handle anything more complicated than that right now. As soon as she got home, she flew up the stairs and went into the bathroom adjoining her bedroom. As she sat down, she prayed, "Please God, don't let me be pregnant. I know what I did was wrong, but I love him so much. Don't let our lives be ruined this way." She waited the requisite 3 minutes the test took, pacing back and forth in her bedroom. Finally, after what seemed like hours, she checked the results. Her face fell. Pregnant. Rubbing her face with her hands, she sat down on her bed for a few minutes, thinking about what she needed to do. Stephen and Faith had become so close in the last few months, but she knew they'd have been even closer if Stephen had been a part of her life from the beginning. She couldn't do what her sister had done and keep the knowledge of his child from him. She just couldn't. She was in a slight daze as she walked down the steps. She went straight to Stephen's office and raised her hand to knock on the door. The door was slightly open and opened more at her knock, so she simply walked in. She went to his desk to sit and wait for him to come back. He was working from home, she knew, and would be back any minute. As she sat, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the words "paternity test results." She hadn't meant to see the words, but once she did, she picked up the paper and read it. Her face turned white. Stephen wasn't Faith's father. He was paying her to take care of a child who wasn't even his. And he knew it. Why hadn't he said anything? He could have kicked them both out at any time. She was staring at the paper in shock when he walked into the room. "Did you need something?" he asked curtly, taking the paper from her hand and laying it on his desk. He had never meant for her to see that paper. "Why didn't you tell me?" She was sitting in his office to tell him she was pregnant, and her sister had lied about him being the father of her baby. How could she tell him now? The look on her face showed her shock. He shrugged. "I knew from the first she wasn't mine. I never slept with your sister." He said the words as if they meant nothing. "We only went out a couple of times before I found out she was sleeping with someone else." "But, why? Why did you want us to move in here, then? Why have you been paying me to take care of my own niece?" She shook her head as if nothing made sense in her world anymore. She was devastated and found herself angrier with her sister than she'd been in a long time. He sighed. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. "You came to my door with nowhere to go. You had a baby in your arms who wasn't even yours. I have the room and I have the money. How could I turn you away?" He paused. "I was so attracted to you from the first, all I could think about was how I had to find a way to make you stay." He turned his hands up and held them out in front of her as if he was looking for her to say something. "Anything." "I see." She stood, her eyes blinded with tears. "I'm sorry we messed up your life so much. It was never my intention." She ran from his office, rushing blindly to her room. A few minutes later, once she'd collected herself, she went down the stairs to the kitchen to get Faith and take her back upstairs. "Thank you for watching her. I really appreciate it." She smiled at Connie, hoping she wouldn't mention the tears that had ravaged her face. Connie smiled at her, putting her hand on her arm. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" Her warm expression told Bailey she'd do anything in her power to sort out whatever was wrong with the younger woman. Bailey shook her head, burying her face in the baby's neck. "I'll be fine. Thanks." She took the baby upstairs and put her on a blanket on the floor with a few toys. Faith was just starting to scoot around and loved to have toys to stick in her mouth. She sat on her bed and thought about what to do. She had to leave. She couldn't keep asking Steven to take care of a baby who wasn't his. But where could she go? She pulled out her cell phone and called Amber. "Hey, Amber. It's Bailey." She tried to keep her voice peppy and happy as she spoke to her friend. "Hi Bailey. Are we on for Saturday?" Her friend's happy voice had her grinning despite her emotions. I have a favor to ask." She knew she sounded like she'd been crying, and she also knew her friend would be more than willing to do anything to help her. It was so hard to be in a position where she had to ask for help again. She hated it. "What's that?" She took a deep breath. "You've said you have a big house. Would you mind if Faith and I came to live with you for a while?" When her friend didn't answer immediately, she said, "I'll pay rent. I have money saved up. And I'll get a job. I promise. I just need somewhere to go for a little while." She closed her eyes as she waited for Amber's response. "Of course you can come here. You know that. Do you know how to get to Coral City?" Coral City was a small rural community not far from South Lake, where she lived with Steven. "No, give me your address. I have a GPS in the SUV." She wished she didn't have to take the SUV, but Steven had her car towed and she had no other way to get anywhere. She scribbled down her friend's address while Faith gnawed on a plastic block, looking up at her with her big blue eyes. Bailey hung up and flew into action. She quickly packed up all of the clothes she'd brought with her and all of Faith's things. She hated taking them, but she'd need them and Steven wouldn't. She'd find a way to get his Cadillac back to him. She went down the stairs to make sure his office door was closed and started carrying things out to her car. When she was finished, she put Faith in her car seat and carried her out to the car. A note was left on the dresser in her bedroom, so Steven wouldn't worry about them. "Steven, I'm so sorry I believed Angela's lies. I should have known better. Faith and I won't continue to be a burden on you. I'm safe and have some money in savings, thanks to your generosity. I'll get your Cadillac back to you as soon as I can arrange it. Thanks for everything you've done. My memories of our time together will always be pleasant. Bailey." The tears poured down her cheeks as she drove out of his driveway and toward Coral City, Texas, where Amber had a small horse ranch. The 30-minute drive helped to clear her mind. She knew she was making the right decision for herself and her baby. Amber was waiting inside the house and flew out as soon as Bailey pulled up. "What happened?" She opened the door of the vehicle and pulled her friend out and into a quick hug. She shook her head sadly, not ready to talk about it. "I promise I'll tell you, but I can't right now. Tomorrow." Hopefully by tomorrow, she'd be able to speak without tears pouring down her face. Her friend helped her carry in everything she'd brought. Bailey carried Faith into the house in her car seat and set her on the floor. "I have no idea where she's going to sleep." She hadn't brought the playpen from Steven's house. Amber grinned. "This is the house I grew up in. My mother kept everything my brother and I used when we were babies. We'll get the crib out of the attic and she'll have her own room in no time." Bailey smiled. "Thank you for being such a good friend." She knew Bailey's brother was going to college and wouldn't be home for a while. "Am I allowed to tell Cody you're here? He's supposed to be coming for his writing lesson tomorrow, so if you don't want Steven to know you're here, then you'd better tell me now and I'll head him off at the pass." "No, it's fine. Steven won't care where we've gone as long as we're out of his hair." She said the words sadly, knowing they were true. Stephen would be thrilled not to have a baby who wasn't his and her aunt, who he no longer felt any passion for living under his roof. Amber hugged her tightly. I'm sorry it didn't work out between you and Stephen. When we were on the island, you two seemed like you were such a good couple. I can't believe it's all gone so wrong for you. Chapter 9. Bailey spent the following day on the internet job hunting. She needed to find something fast because she knew it would be much harder after she started showing. She also needed to have medical insurance immediately to pay for her prenatal care and for Faith's doctor's visits. She wasn't feeling sick yet, but Angela had spent almost her entire pregnancy in bed. Of course, Angela had always milked any illness for all it was worth. By early afternoon, she'd set up 2 job interviews for the following day. She only prayed she could get one of them. They were both in northern Fort Worth, so the drive wouldn't be long for as long as she was staying with Amber. And then she could go ahead and get her own place soon. Stephen had paid her a very healthy salary and she'd saved almost every penny of it because her room and board had been included. She felt guilty for taking money from him, but what else could she do at this point? Eventually she'd save up enough money to pay him back, even if it took her the rest of her life. When Cody came for his writing lesson, he stopped in to say hi to Bailey. He had always loved little Faith and played with her while they talked. He didn't ask any questions about what had happened between her and his friend, but he didn't have to. Seeing the deep circles under her eyes and the evidence of her tears was all Cody needed. After he left, he drove straight to Stephen's house. He didn't knock, but instead went inside and stormed into the office. What did you do to her? Stephen gave his friend a cold look. I don't know what you're talking about. The shock of finding Bailey and Faith gone this morning was almost more than he could take. He'd come to his office and buried himself in work, avoiding Connie as much as possible. She'd made it clear to him at breakfast time she thought it was his fault their houseguests had gone. The hell you don't. Bailey has moved in with Amber and she's obviously been crying her eyes out. What did you do? Cody's hands were fisted at his sides as if he was going to start hitting something any moment. Stephen leaned back in his chair, scrubbing his face with his hand. Is that where they went? I'm glad they're safe. He was shocked by the anger on his friend's face. They'd always believed each other first, and no woman had ever come between them. I didn't kick her out if that's what you think. She found out yesterday Faith isn't mine. I guess she decided she didn't have a right to be here after that. He knew there was more to it than that, but he wasn't going to tell Cody. There were limits to what he'd tell even his closest friends. Cody gave his friend a confused look. You always knew she wasn't yours. Didn't you tell her? I told her I wanted a paternity test. And we had it done. I never meant for her to see the results. I only did it in case something came along later. I shouldn't have. I should have just let her think Faith was mine. He was still kicking himself for leaving the results out on his desk like that. Of course, Bailey had been avoiding his office, so how was he supposed to know she'd walk in there while he was getting lunch? You need to go after her, you know. She loves you. Stephen shook his head. She told me on the way home from the island our physical relationship was over. She said it was best for Faith. I was planning on buying her an engagement ring. His voice sounded sadder than Cody had ever heard it. I don't even know what I did wrong to make her feel that way. Are you insane? She's living with Amber and crying all the time. Go and tell her how you feel. You're making a huge mistake. Stephen looked at his friend, feeling hope for the first time since she'd left. Do you think she'd even see me? It had to be worth a shot. He was sitting here miserable without her. If she threw the ring back in his face, at least he'd always know he'd done everything he could to make the relationship work. Get the ring and go to her. Trust me. All she wants is to come home to you. He turned and started to leave the office. And yes, I will be your best man. Stephen shook his head at his friend. Suddenly he felt galvanized into action. He grabbed his car keys and his wallet, and headed for the nearest jewelry store. He picked a pink diamond, thinking it would suit her more than a traditional stone, and left the store at a dead run. He had to get her back, and he had to do it tonight. He called Cody from the road. "I forgot to get her address from you." "Where is she?" He felt like an idiot and grimaced as he heard his friend's laughter. He knew Cody and Justin would be needling him over this for years to come. He punched in the address while stopped at a light and followed the annoying GPS voice to the address Cody had given him. What he found when he got out of his car was a ranch that had seen better days. He got out of the car, nervous for the first time since Cody had left his house. The ring was in the front pocket of his jeans as he knocked on the door. Bailey had just put Faith in her saucer to play when she heard the knock. Amber was doing one of her group lessons for horse-crazed girls, so she went to the door. When she saw Stephen standing there, she almost closed the door, but sucked in her breath and opened it for him. "Hi." What else could she say? Had he come to get the car back? "I miss you." He hadn't meant to start out that way, but it's what he was thinking, and the words just flew out of his mouth. "We'd barely spoken for months. How could you miss me?" She stared at him in disbelief. He sighed. "I liked knowing you were there. I liked knowing I could go to your room and talk to you if I wanted. I liked knowing Faith would be there if I wanted to see her." He reached out a hand and brushed away the tear falling down her cheek with his thumb. "I love you, Bailey. Please come home with me." She stood with her mouth open, gaping at him. What? She must be hearing things, because Stephen would never say that to her. Never. She stood watching as he dug in his pocket for something. Suddenly he dropped to one knee and held out a ring box to her. "Bailey, will you do me the honor of being my wife? We'll raise our beautiful baby together, and hope we are blessed with a dozen more." She blinked her eyes as the tears started again. Why? Why did he suddenly want to marry her? He'd never shown any indication he even wanted her living in the same house he was in. What had come over him? "Because I love you and I don't think a life without you is worth living." He paused. "I used to think money meant happiness, but it doesn't. Happiness is having you beside me. Happiness is holding Faith and burping her. Happiness is everything I felt when we were on the island. Please, Bailey. Marry me." He held his breath as he waited for her answer. She put her hand over her mouth and sucked in a breath. Finally, after a moment, she nodded. "But there's something you need to know first." It was time to tell him. She had to now, because he needed to know there would be 4 of them, not 3. He got to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing the top of her head. "What do you want to tell me?" He found her ring finger and slipped the ring on, pleased that he'd guessed right on the size. Whatever it was, he didn't care. As long as she was by his side, they could handle anything. She stared down at the ring on her finger as she fought to find the courage to tell him. Finally, she looked up into his eyes. "By marrying me, you're not just taking on me and Faith." She laid her hand over her still flat stomach. "I'm going to have your baby." His eyes widened and his face broke out into a huge grin. He picked her up and swung her around. Faith started clapping and giggling. "I can't wait." He put Bailey back on her feet and reached down to pull Faith out of her saucer, noticing her for the first time since he'd arrived. "Are you ready to be a big sister, Faithy?" Faith patted his cheek happily. "I guess that's a yes." He grinned at Bailey. "Come home with me." She nodded. "I need to leave a note for Amber and pack up all our things again." She looked back over her shoulder at him as she wrote the note quickly. "Do you want a big wedding?" Not that she cared over much. As long as she was his wife and they were a family, she cared about nothing else. I don't care one way or the other. I just want to be married to you, and I want us to officially adopt Faith, so she'll be ours. He wanted it clear Faith was his daughter by love, even if she wasn't his natural daughter. Let's just do a small ceremony then. Maybe just a justice of the peace. We can have the gang there, but no one else. He knew immediately she meant Cody, Justin, Amber, and Sarah. That's fine. I really don't care. As long as I get you for my wife. The look he gave her told her in no uncertain terms she needed to hurry. He wanted her home with him where she belonged. She smiled at him, able to be content about the future for the first time in a long time. I love you, Stephen. His whole face lit up at her words. And I love you. No more running. No more running.